think I broke a fiddle player.
Unlike Uncle Bonsai, we don't have to pay for this by the inch.
Yes. They have a live recording where they mention that.
Okay, so here we are, episode 2, Nestor. Now, in the intro videos, I said that Ulysses does not directly parallel the Odyssey, it only shadows it. So this is a great example of that. In the Odyssey, at this point in the game, Telemachus goes to see Nestor, who was in the Trojan War with Telemachus's father. And he wants to know if he has any information about him. Did he die in a war? Do you know where he is? So he goes off to see Nestor, and he wants to get information about his father. Now, certainly in Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus is not going to Mr. Deasy to get any information about his father. So we're not drawing these direct correlations. There's only a shadowing effect. Okay, so Nestor in the Odyssey is a bit of a blowhard. He's kind of a pompous character. He's bilious. He also is unreliable. So when he's questioned about certain things that happened in the Trojan War, sometimes he kind of hints at this, and sometimes he kind of hints at this, and he says this happened, and later it turns out to be not true. So he is not very reliable as an information source. In the Odyssey, we will find in Ulysses there are some similar traits. Also, he has a lot of kids. In the Odyssey, the Nestor has a bunch of sons and a bunch of daughters, and when Telemachus gets there, he sees all these kids. So there's a bit of a shadowing parallel there. That's enough. That's about it. Now, some of our themes in this chapter. We have the theme of history, and there is a bit of discussion about history. Deasy makes some points about history heading toward a target or an outcome. Now, as I said in the introduction, Joyce was a subscriber that history was of a cyclical nature, and we can be trapped in it and repeat, or we can work to escape that cyclical trap. So look in this chapter for references to history. There's a bit of a debate between Stephen and Deasy about the nature of history, whether it's linear or cyclical. Look for those references and see what conclusion you come to. Because Deasy has a very different view of history than Stephen does. And some of the great quotes of the book come out of this chapter. So look for those too. I think they will strike you immediately. There are some profound things. Note that Stephen's students are pretty much dullards. This is a theme not only of the book, but also of Joyce, that the people are in a stupor. He felt that the Irish people were just in a stupor. Joyce believed this. He incorporates this in the book, that they're just sort of bungling through. They've been usurped by Britain. Their language has been usurped. Their culture has been usurped. And they're kind of just sleepwalking through it in this stupor. And they've given up the intellect and the spark. So look for references of that. You'll see in the classroom that the students are pretty much dullards, and Stephen thinks, poor kids, they're just dumb as a brick. And he also makes a reference to the one kid, Sergeant, that he's just ugly. and a face only a mother could love. Now, that is also a reference to Stephen and his relationship to his mother. So this whole mother-son relationship sort of enters into this chapter in a rather elusive way. So watch for that as well as Stephen interacts with the students and he has thoughts about them. Now, notice, just in general, that when a nation goes into decline, it tends to look backwards, or the people tend to look backwards. So when a nation starts to lose its power and influence, they look back to the glory days. Okay, I think you can find examples of that in the United States. You can find examples of that in the collapse of the Soviet Union. You find examples of that in the decline of the British Empire. The people tend to look backwards. Now, Joyce was writing this book during a period of time called the Great Irish Revival. Okay, so they were looking back to the good old days, which Ireland really never had. So he's at a time when people are encouraging him to look back to revitalize the Irish culture, the Irish language, Irish writing, Irish roots, sort of go back to the good old days, which Joyce knew there never were good old days. And he really didn't like that. Now, interestingly, one of the spearheads of this Irish revival was Yeats, William Butler Yeats. And Yeats was a huge force in this Irish revival. And Joyce and Yeats were friends. Now, Joyce, when he first met Yeats, Yeats said that, boy, this boy is a genius. And Joyce said of Yeats that he's all right, he can write a few poems. So, you know, Yeats is actually one of the great poets of the last century. However, he disliked that Yeats was trying to revive and look backwards rather than look forward and energize and do new things. So Yeats and his style of poetry was more about looking back to the culture and bringing that into his poetry and his writings. So you see references to the Old Irish writing and the Old Irish mythologies, whereas Joyce scrapped that stuff, moved forward. So these guys are like diametrically opposed. So I bring that up because there are allusions to this throughout the chapter, whether we're going to choose to look back and try to recapture the old past, or whether we're going to look forward and do a new thing. Now, Stephen is constantly dealing with this as the young poetic intellectual. He wants to like charge forward to a new era, and he's kind of tired of all this old junk. He wants new thought and forward thinking. So this is very important to this chapter. Now, our two primary characters in this chapter are Stephen Dedalus and Deasy. Deasy's the headmaster of the school. Now, Deasy's a Tory, so that means he supports the British rule. He's not all in favor of the overcoming British rule and home rule and all that jazz. He sort of poo-poos that, all this nonsense of independence and we're lucky to be a part of the great British Empire, which means he's probably also Protestant, and there's some clashing about that bit. Not that they argue religion, because I think that Deasy thinks that Stephen probably is a loyal Catholic, whereas Deasy is the English supporting Protestant, and Stephen is really beyond that stuff. So look at how that's treated in this chapter. I think it's rather interesting, actually. Now, Deasy makes a statement about what is the pride of the Englishman, what is the thing that the Englishman is most proud of. And Stephen says, well, that that the sun never sets on his empire, and there's that expression that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And Deasy says, no, that's not it. He says, I always paid my way. And there's great irony in that, because always paid your way as a colonial power. Basically, you take and get what you can out of the colony, and that's how you always pay your way, and then you leave the people destitute and ruined. And so for Deasy to make this statement as an Irishman is actually rather sad, and that's the point that Joyce is trying to slip in there to us. And as again, back to my introduction, Joyce is never painfully obvious. He never clubs us over the head. You have to be paying attention to catch his points, and that's one that's rather delicately slipped in there. That Deasy is pro-English in a rather sad way. Also, Deasy is very anti-Semitic, and you'll find very obvious references to that. I mean, if somebody's a bigot, they're a bigot, and I guess you could say that's clubbing you over the head. But the main point isn't. But pay attention to that. You will see Deasy being very anti-Semitic, and Stephen doesn't really stand up for the Jewish people, but it's not something that he subscribes to. Anti-Semitism is not part of his makeup. There is also, as I mentioned before, there are references to the mother-son relationship. Watch for those, because Stephen is still dealing with the whole guilt notion of not kneeling to pray over his dying mother. So he's stuck to his principles, but yet he suffers some guilt from that, and that will come up later in the book as well. So keep watching for those references. They occur throughout. Also, there are references to cattle. Now, Deasy has a letter about the foot and mouth disease, which has possibly broken out. There have been some cases reported in Ireland, and that could mean that there would be no more exportation of Irish beef, which could destroy the Irish economy. And there is concern about that, and that's real. At this time, that was going on, and you can look that up. But Deasy believes that it can be cured, and the experts of Europe can come here and they can tell us how to cure it, and there'll be no problem. So this idea that this is a problem is all nonsense. So this is again the sort of blustery Deasy, who's speaking about something that he really doesn't know anything about. And so pay attention to that. That's more of that sort of BSer that Deasy is. And the references to cattle are important because, again, we have that usurpation threaded in there. And I think probably we can look at the Irish as the cattle of the British Empire, that they're there for use, disposal, to be consumed. There are references about the you'll find them through the book about the meat for the rich guy's plate. So watch for those. Now, there's a confusing reference in this chapter, and that's when the guys are talking history. They don't get any of it. You can tell they're dumb as a brick. Stephen's trying to teach this lesson, and they're just lost. And they wander off into this thing about a pier, and then they're off topic altogether. And then they say, "Give us a riddle." Now, there's a great irony there, which I think is really laughable. You got these students that are just dumb as boards, and then they say, "Oh, give us a riddle, sir." Like, they could solve it. So Stephen gives this weird riddle, and this is based on a real thing written by a guy, P.W. Joyce. Now, Stephen doesn't quote it verbatim, but he gets pretty close. And then he says, well, that's a fox burying his mother under a bush or something. That's the answer. And the students are like, what? This riddle, go back and read the riddle. It makes no sense. And then the answer is like, where do you get that? It's based on the writings of a guy, P.W. Joyce, which is sort of a little pun there, actual. You can search that as well. And it is a riddle that you have to know the answer to. So it's kind of like the ultimate riddle would be not solvable unless you already had the answer. So it's kind of like a encryption algorithm or the ultimate password or something. And so Stephen is just sort of yanking them in that this riddle, they can't solve it, obviously. They're not going to be able to solve it. And he knows they couldn't solve the simplest thing. If you said, I land on a flower and get pollen and I live in a hive, what am I? They wouldn't know it was a bee. He knows they're dumb as bricks. So he lays this riddle that is only of value if you know the answer. Now, that is, I would say, a rather thin, veiled allusion to the need of education. If you don't have the answer, you're not going to know the answer. This is not something you're going to figure out. You have to know. So there are certain things that you have to be taught. Now, Stephen's the teacher, right? So I think you can do some interesting pondering with that if you want, or you can just leave it. It's not super important, but I think it's interesting that Stephen gives a riddle that can only be solved if you already know the answer. That's kind of a cool thing, I think. Again, we have the poet's internal dialogue. So you're going to find Stephen's mind going around again as he looks at the students, as he thinks about Deasy, as he waits for Deasy to pay him, and there's some discussion about money and sorting money and properly handling money. Deasy is always lecturing him. So this lecturing him and telling him how to manage his money, and you ought to buy this kind of wallet, boy, and if you got this wallet, you won't misplace your money. And there's a bit of a fatherly tone to this advice, that I want to help you out, son, but Stephen knows this guy. What he has to say is of no value. And Stephen's going to take the money and go get drunk anyway, so he's not even paying any attention to this stuff. Now, there's one very interesting line in this book, and I'm going to leave you with this to think about for the Nestor episode. They have a little discussion about God. And Deasy makes another one of his anti-Semitic cracks about Jewish people, that they've abandoned the light or something. And then Stephen says he hears them playing hockey outside. They're playing field hockey, the boys. And one of the boys shouts, and Stephen says, "That's God." And Deasy says, "What? What? What?" And Stephen says, "God is a shout in the street." Now, I'd like you to think about that line and what that means. And say something in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what you think that means. What is your interpretation of that? Do you think maybe Stephen's an atheist? Or is he trying to say something else? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks, and I'll see you in episode 3.